All right, so when you have big problems, you need to find big solutions. And to do that, you need to get perspectives from everybody at the table. To that end, we've invited representatives from the agricultural, ranching, and wildlife industries to come and share their thoughts and perspectives on the future of groundwater in Texas. I am pleased to introduce Jim Bradbury, who is the managing partner at James D. Bradbury, PLLC, who will be moderating the panel. I'm going to let Jim introduce the panel, but in the meantime, can we welcome these gentlemen to the stage?
Buenos dias. All right, good morning. You know, as a lawyer, you spend a lot of time going to conferences of other lawyers, and I can just tell you how refreshing it is to look out there and see real people doing real things. So thank you for that. I want to introduce my panel. First, thank you to TAGGED, and thank you to the program committee for asking agriculture to come to this conference and talk a little bit about what's going on in agriculture as well as its relationship to groundwater and surface uses. But before I do, to my right, David Gibson, Texas Corn Producers Executive Director. He's a friend of this group, and you all know him well. To his right, James Oliver, and James wears several hats. James is a banker, he's a rancher, he's likewise one of the key players for the Texas and Southwest cattle raisers on policy and legislation. And then to his right, Andrew Earl is a director of conservation for the Texas Wildlife Association. He's we're very happy to have him down here in Texas. He came from a wide policy-making background in wildlife on a national scale, but came to Texas and joined Texas Wildlife Association. So we're going to get an ag perspective, but I want to underscore the talents of these three people up here in the policy-making realm. They are engaged in agriculture, but at the same time, they are aware that agriculture has to be involved in the policy discussion on a variety of issues as well, including groundwater. So I want to underscore that for them. Okay, so maybe following our last panel, this is a good segue from, you know, so much of the discussion on groundwater is subterranean. Now we want to go up to the top of the surface and discuss what's going on the surface out in rural Texas and how that interacts with our groundwater policy. You'll see from the title of this session the word crossroads, which is not an accident. Crossroads is when you get to that sign and you can go right, you can go left, you can go straight, or you can go back the direction that you came from. And when it comes to agriculture and groundwater, we really are at a crossroads right now. Texas has grown. The demands for municipal supply of groundwater is exponential, looking down the future. But at the same time, we've got, you know, a deep, rich heritage in agriculture. And that goes even further to the concept of food security. I mean, last legislative session, the legislature passed a substantial enhancement to the right to farm. If you're not familiar with that, it's a very strong statement from the legislature about food security and the need for our rural lands to be working lands and continue as working lands. But then in addition to the statute that was passed, it went to the voters of the state of Texas, and we now have a constitutional amendment in favor of the right to farm, recognizing the interests of rural communities in Texas, many of which that you're a part of. But I want to set the stage up here that our rural lands and our rural communities are our key infrastructure. That's where our rain falls, our waters begin, and we produce our food. But likewise, there are essential communities out there. There's a strong industry, and the tendency in Texas of these cities just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're looking at how to feed them. But at the same time, we've got to remember these far-flung places in Texas. We have to remember how to feed those communities and keep them thriving. So with that as setting the stage, I want to roll down through here and start with you, David, and talk maybe just a little bit about your association, the number of members, the acres that it involved, a little bit of the production, and then maybe just a short perspective on groundwater for corn producers.
Okay, just sounds like this is on a lot of echo, as he said. Thank you for letting me be up here and represent today corn growers, but I feel like when I'm sitting here, I'm representing all of our production agriculture out there, because I have very few farmers that just grow corn. They generally grow cotton, wheat, soybeans, raise cattle, raise hogs, whatever. So groundwater is critical to my members. We grow about 2.1 to 2.3 million acres of corn a year in the state. A little less than 1 million acres of that is dependent to a large part on irrigation water, groundwater. Hearing the discussion today of how much is being permitted, it's going to be hard for our producers to live with some of those permits, which I see my friend of long time out there, I told should be up here, Ronnie Hopper, that's on a farm when I first started in Hale County, and we've talked about water in that area ever since I've been there. Our corn growers generate about $1 billion a year, sometimes a little more in revenue to their farm. All of that goes back and is spent in their local community. And most of those local communities are now have aging water systems. They're running out of water, just like we're seeing declines out on our farms. But in turn with that, we're Texas cattle feeders. We feed about 25% of the nation's cattle right up there on the high plains, primarily over the Ogallala Aquifer. We're now the number 3 dairy state in the nation, primarily over the Ogallala Aquifer. Most of our corn and our silage, the sorghum that's grown, the sorghum silage, all of our product is going right back through this cycle that's putting food on everyone's table. So it's critical to our producers that we still have ways to manage water. And we've done a lot as organizationally. Our local water districts up there are elected by farmers. They've got farmers sitting on those, and they're very capable of working together with all of the other farmers. So this whole groundwater thing is real important. I have to be sure I remember, I've got single county water districts in other part of the state, that those guys are under a whole different attack than our guys over the Ogallala about how water's being managed. And I think we'll get into that a bit more.
We will. James, turn to you. Talk just a little bit about Texas and Southwest cattle raisers, the beef industry, and how many acres head and that interaction with groundwater.
So Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association is the state's oldest livestock association. We represent 28,000 members that care for 4 million head of cattle and are stewards of 76 million acres of range and pasture land in Texas and Southwest. The livestock industry contributes $15.5 billion to the Texas economy. Those are the most recent numbers that we have. We depend on groundwater through every part of our production cycle, from cow-calf to yearling to the feed yards. And so it's probably the most important input into our production cycle.
All right, Andrew, welcome. Really nice to have you up here. Talk about wildlife. And I think some people think wildlife, they think deer, right? But there is a land component to wildlife and our open space that may not be in row crop or beef production. Give a little perspective of your membership and the amount of acres and issues that are involved there, and how that relates to groundwater.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jim, for having me. TWA is at its core a private property rights association. We were established in 1985 by a group of landowners that realized there was a need for a voice for private property rights in Austin. Today, we have about 6,000 active members across the state. We're actually about to do a survey of our membership to get a better sense of their the acreage that they own and manage. So I don't want to get out ahead of that, but you know, these are folks that range from, you know, living in a high rise in downtown San Antonio to, you know, managing hundreds of thousand acres in West Texas. And you know, all of that, like James said, is so much. You know, their land stewardship is really is powered by access to water and the ability to ensure that the practices that they undertake are effective, and that is really the key to keeping so many of our working lands and this you know, open spaces, our infrastructure, as you said, keeping that intact as we see more rapid growth and accelerated changing land use across the state. So more valuable than ever, really.
Good, thank you. All right. You know, it's Texas, so we seem to bob in and out of drought. And while I'm not a scientist, I mean, a lot of people look at drought and think you're in or you're out. But if we're looking back to 2010, I mean, we've been in drought, right? And then we get the rains, and then it all looks good. But then we're back in there. So I'm curious your perspectives on what you do in your association, coming in and out of drought, but maybe being on a long-term drying trend that we're having, how that impacts groundwater usage for your members and what you see down the future, you know, if we continue the path that we're on. Maybe, David, you go first.
Okay. Well, you know, for the growers I work with and all of their neighbors that grow other crops, drought is something we live with all of the time, and as Jim said, it seems like since 2010 this has become more prevalent. But I can go back in my mind. I began working in Hale County as an assistant county agent back many years ago now, in the 70s. And the thing that really struck me then, and I mentioned this to Ronnie, was we had some farmers that drought didn't concern them, because then the wells were just flowing full force. They really wanted to. At that time, we didn't know better. We didn't have the science and the technology you have now. And they'd say, let's let the rain stay away, because that way we can fully time the accurate water on our crops. That's not right anymore. We've gone now to where our farmers, if one of them was sitting here in my shoes and their pivots are all running, or their drip systems are running, they've got probably their iPad right in front of them just to be sure if one well shuts off, if they have a surge in power, or they have anything happen, they manage their water minute by minute now. It's not like it used to be. They've done a lot of this with their own dollars. There's been a little bit of money from the state. The state really hadn't put a lot of money to helping conserve water on the farms. We get a lot of help from USDA through NRCS programs that's helped implement, but everything they've done, they've invested 25 to 50 to 75% of the cost out of their pocket on their farms. And or they've done 100%, because it's just like we've got an ad that we run in some of the cities. We got a young farmer that's about 35 years old, and he's got his two little boys trailing him, and he's telling everybody, we do everything we can to manage this so my sons can have their kids trailing after them later. And they're very very concerned about this water, and we're spending a lot of money. As far as the droughts, it does seem harder. If you drove through the southern Texas Panhandle on July 4th, you thought it was a garden spot. You go back today, we're starting to look like a desert. I mean, I live next to a cotton field and next to a sorghum field and around a bunch of grass, and this brown color that's on top of these tables is what we're looking like right now.
Andrew, I want to go to you and talk about the impacts of drought on wildlife and open lands, and also maybe just comment a bit about what you know are land trends, what changes we see in our rural lands.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It seems like these, in an extended drought period like we're in, the wet years that you get every now and again just kind of seem to camouflage the broader issue. And when you have a year like this where, we might be certainly more getting more water than last year in the hill country, you're still in a lot of these aquifers recharging 5% per rainfall per year. And it's getting further and further out of reach for so many of our springs that decades ago were running year round. And what that means for open spaces is just that these ecosystems are often becoming less biodiverse and more arid, and it compounds these issues over time. I'm not sure if I...
Yeah, no, you've got it. And James, I don't think there's any more iconic image of drought than a cattle ranch, right? That doesn't have any water. So I'm going to tee that up for you. I mean, talk about drought, because my perspective is, a lot of the production, like the last panel is talking about these high volume production permits, you're producing a steady state volume there that is really unrelated to drought. But for what we do, when the drought comes and the rains stop, the pumps turn on, and you've got to pump harder and harder and harder the longer the drought. So with that tee up, give us your perspective for the ranchers.
Well, the biggest impact is we have not recovered our cattle numbers since the 2010-11 drought. We are at the lowest cow inventory since 1951. And as we keep going through these droughts as an industry, we're just never able to recover the numbers. And something I've read, and it's been proved out, that after every drought, you can run fewer and fewer livestock of any species. But just as a practical matter on the land, in 10 and 11 and 12, especially in West Texas, we were losing wells. They were just caving in. And so we were having to re-drill wells. I know today we have members in Central Texas that can't find water. They're out. And once again, that's the most critical input to our production cycle.
Jim, I apologize. You asked about land trends, and I kind of just went in a different direction. But
Do you want some more coffee, or you
I
good?
could use a cup.
All right.
So
You're good.
To James's point, last 20 years, upwards of 2 million acres of working lands that we've lost in Texas, and those asphalt certainly doesn't permeate water nearly as well as soil does, and I think we can all draw pretty logical conclusion as to the effects that has when compounded with drought.
Concrete's the last crop. We're losing over 1,000 acres a day in the state of Texas. And this number is stale. I know it's changed. I don't know if it's been measured recently, but in 2017, 84% of the rainfall in the state of Texas fell on private working lands.
Yeah, well, another dynamic many of you may be familiar with that I'd throw in the hopper on our rural working lands is, our new neighbors from the city who are coming out and buying places, and then the advent of subdivision out there, people buying 1,200 acres and cutting them up into 20 acres, and everybody running down to the GCD to get a groundwater well, right? I mean, have you all seen that?
Well, we certainly see that and all around the state, and especially from the areas I represent, when you go to the Amarillo area or the Lubbock area, it's amazing how many fields are now housing developments. And I know friends from High Plains and North Plains Panhandle, there's all kinds of issues that's come with that for the groundwater districts. But from the farmer perspective, we look up there and we may see 100 wells where there used to be one well, and we wonder, the guy says, what's that doing to me over here on my farm? So it's got to do with that. The other thing that really kind of comes down to is, do we want to continue to use our water to grow food, or are we going to use it to grow grass and play golf on? And that's kind of an issue that my farmers drive to buy some of these big golf courses. We hear the towns talking about water shortage, and we wonder, where's that water coming from?
Well, that tees up the next issue I want to talk about. I mean, we've got a very complex water planning process in the state, which was alluded to in the last panel. And if you look at a lot of the graphs that are driving that, there's, a line that's going down like this, which is agriculture, and a line going up like this, which is municipal demand. And a lot of that is groundwater. So what I'd like, we call this panel the Crossroads, and I think many times that conflict is viewed as a zero-sum game, that the cities are going to grow, they've got the money, and agriculture is going to be sacrificed there. I'm hopeful there's another way out of that, that it is not a zero-sum game, but I'm curious if each of your thoughts, and any one of you can jump in on this, let's call it a conflict, but how are we going to reconcile that? I mean, we have cities that need massive volumes of water. We have large projects like we covered in the last panel, but how is that going to fit in with rural agriculture?
I'll jump in with one. You're sitting right here probably drinking water from the San Antonio water system that may have been bought from a farmer over by Uvalde that used to grow vegetables or grow corn or grow cotton, that has now sold that water to the water system, and it's changed the face of the ag economy right in this area, just right outside of this city. And we kind of, we want to be sure as we go how that pertains and what the impact is and what it ultimately is to the local rural economies out in those areas farther away from San Antonio. What we see in a lot of cases is people, even with the oil and gas industry, they get wells, they move to town. I don't mean water wells, I mean oil and gas wells. Well, we do that, we're really seeing some declines in our rural areas, and part of that's evident right just west of where we're sitting.
Andrew, thoughts on this?
I think it's a lot of it really comes down to more resources for the folks like this in the room, and their ability to coordinate kind of at a more regional scale, and then also in the ability to put some teeth behind some of these when a permit's put forward, make it. We had a discussion just before this about it's very difficult to say no to what may be a flawed permit, and so giving more resources for legal resources, perhaps one area where we could put some more teeth behind some of these decisions that are made.
Yeah. Last panel, they talked about the DFC, the desired future conditions, and I love that concept, and I'm sort of curious about that to agriculture. Talking about food security, do we, among us in agriculture, really need to be thinking about what our desired future conditions are in terms of production, right? Because if you don't have an idea of what production that you want in 20, 30, or 50 years from a food standpoint, you don't know what you need to be doing today. James, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the answer to your previous question is education, understanding, and collaboration. I know in the livestock industry, we've been guilty of kind of locking the gate and hiding. But this urban-rural divide that we've been talking about, and that conversation is becoming more critical every day, is, the urban audiences need to understand that as livestock producers, we really strive to be the best stewards of these scarce resources, whether it be water, whether it be soil, all those things. And we don't do enough to tell our story. We need to do more about getting out and letting people know the things that we do. We are the sponge. We are the key to healthy groundwater infrastructures. And we don't do a good enough job of that. But understanding what we do, us educating that urban audience, their understanding of what we do and how critical that working land infrastructure is to the water that comes out of their tap. And then collaboration in these long-term plans, to your point about ranchettes and some of the most productive agricultural land, be it farm ground or grasslands, that have been carved up and another straw put in the ground. And those, if you really look around the metroplexes, the growth has been on those productive ag lands. The tallgrass prairie around Fort Worth, the blacklands around Dallas, between, just east of Seguin in that blackland country, all the homes that have popped up there. And so, not to be anti-development, but they need to understand that that audience needs to understand what we do every day and strive to be good at.
One of the great things about this conference is sometimes the best information you get is out in the hall drinking coffee, or in my case, in the bar at night. But I had several conversations just last night with different people about this conflict between municipal need and agriculture, and discussing the potential for transactional approach to that, where producers are compensated in a formal way for their groundwater or not producing. And I'm curious, just let's call that a market approach. How do you all feel about that? Does that offend you, or do you think it's something that's viable, David?
I'm not going to, it doesn't offend me, and I don't think it offends any of the people I work with. But it's got to be viable. We've invested, most of these families have invested a lot of infrastructure monies. You've built, you had value on that land, you've been taxed for that value. And if we're going to do a transition, it's how do they retain that? Most farmers and probably a lot of ranchers, the value of that land is their retirement. And so if we're going to retire it and change the production capabilities of it, I think it would have to be done in a very equitable, feasible way for that to happen.
Either of y'all have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think putting a value to the conservation of our water resources would be huge. We put a value on the use of it. We do that in some ways almost already through our farm and ranch land conservation program. Water conservation is an ancillary benefit of it. It's not necessarily a target of the program, but there's more and more conversations I know federally about a groundwater conservation easement program, which is a fantastic idea. I think we could all get behind. So yeah, I see James nodding his head. I'll turn it over.
I think as far as our members are concerned, as long as it's reasonable, and most importantly, that it's voluntary. If they're given the option of an entity, be it federal, state, local, whatever that entity might be, to incentivize their conservation of water, I don't think that would be offensive to our members. And to your point, yes, they're trying to write a groundwater conservation section into the farm bill that's hung up forever. But
yeah, on good trigger of thought, Andrew and James, both of you have a touch with the conservation easement world, and I guess for members of the audience may not be familiar, if you put a conservation easement on a 2,000 acre tract of property, just explain a bit what that does related to the groundwater in place.
Well, you're yielding your development right, and that ensures, that in perpetuity, the ability of that land to act as a sponge and, and hold, as much water as nature is willing to give it.
And go ahead, James.
And most conservation easements prohibit the development and off-premise transfer of water, so that water does stay with your place. You do retain the right to develop water resources for production on your own land. You just can't send it someplace else.
So it's a conservation tool. You can still lose it at the edges, but in essence, you've put a permanent restriction on that property to preserve that groundwater in place, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about threats on the horizon for agriculture, and they could be of any source: legislative, weather, climatic. What are the big threats that? And I'll start down there with you, Andrew. What are the biggest threats you see on the horizon pertaining to wildlife and open space?
Well, we've talked already about just land trends in Texas generally. We are thinking already. It seems like we just got through the 88th legislative session. We're already looking ahead to
Here they
next.
come again, right?
And not just in Texas, but in DC there are always kind of attacks on conservation, whether it's people trying to open up the 1D1 tax valuation. We mentioned the farm bill that's been hung up in kind of a in partisan gridlock for the better part of a year now. Going to expire on September 30th, probably with a short-term extension through the new year. But generally, there's this growing illiteracy to the value of natural resource conservation as our urban areas just continue to expand. So it's a big priority of our organization is both youth and adult education and getting that word out on the value of private land stewardship to the broader Texas.
I think as an association and looking to the next session and down the line, we feel like there's slowly being those groundwater rights that we hold so dear are slowly being eroded somewhat through oil and gas industry, kind of a slippery slope, produced water and some of those things. There were some other issues in the last session that we know are going to pop up. And as an association, we will continue to fight to maintain the groundwater rights we have today as private landowners and not let them be allowed to be classified more like minerals and change the nature of that right. But I think for us as an association, members across the state, that may be one of the biggest issues we see coming down the road.
David?
I think they've hit a lot of the key points, and we do have right now, from an ag standpoint, from conservation, we had the largest influx of money from the Inflation Reduction Act ever into conservation. Well, it's all well and good until you go in and apply, figure out how that fits on your farm, and find out that it's nearly impossible to meet what got wrote into some of those guidelines. Hopefully that's going to be changed. And of course, as you mentioned, the farm bill's hung up. We're just, my members primarily are just want to preserve the fact that we've got, Chapter 36 protects us right now out on our farms and with our water, and that we be careful about losing that. One of the kind of an outside concern outside of a legislative is how we maintain our economies out from an irrigated agricultural income to maintain those local economies. And then a secondary thought, I think, and it's for all of us, you know, if Texas is the #2 ag producing state in the country. We've got, like I said, 25% of the fed cattle that go on your plate is beef. We've got #3 state in dairy production. We've got a large broiler industry, large hog industries, fruits and vegetables. And what happens when that goes away in our total food supply? I think it's a food security thing, and we're concerned about us being able to grow and viably produce it, but then I can't help but think, I've got 10 grandkids, and we've thought about this stuff of buying toys and wondering about the paint on it that come from China. And then I really shudder when I think about what's on the food if we go to importing it from other countries. And I think that's a big concern we all have to think about if we just become an urban society and don't have any real food production in our plans.
I mean, good point on the cities and rural communities, because it seems to me if you kind of back up the math and look at the industries that support rural communities and rural counties in Texas and look what they do, the health of our rural Texas is very groundwater dependent, it seems to me. That's all they've got out there, particularly when you're in the western side of the state. I want, any one of you can jump in on this, but I mean, 10, 15 years ago, people discussed theoretically areas of the state coming out of ag production being just purely due to loss of groundwater, but that doesn't seem theoretical anymore. I hear more and more people talking about that, particularly up in your part of the world in Ogallala, David, that families are beginning to have to plan for that. How do you exit an operation and land holdings when you simply just don't have it anymore? Can you comment on that?
Well, that is a big challenge. I mean, I have a 15-person board that I work for, and they're all farmers scattered from the North Plains to the Rio Grande Valley. And we've got, at nearly all points, farmers that are dependent on groundwater or in the Rio Grande Valley surface water looking at how they're going to transition. They've worked on it for years, and they're looking very much an accelerated rate now of how those transitions can be made. And it's a challenge. And then if you decide that you're going to transition out, the thing for someone coming into agriculture, any level, is what it costs to get there. So it's an everyday challenge on all of our family farms.
Any other thoughts on that?
We're seeing it more and more often, and it's a difficult place to be in as a landowner. You have very few options, and often there might not be a favorable one. We're seeing more and more as lands come out of production. There's a transition into renewable energy leasing on our lands, and that's becoming a bigger and bigger kind of question that we get as an organization from our landowners is how can they, when they're entering into a leasing agreement with one of these developers, ensure that they're doing it in a way that can that protects a tax status that they have on a portion of their property, or protects their, ensures their ability to continue to steward or manage their lands, or raise cattle, whatever it may be, the best they can.
I bragged on all three of you all as policy folks, so I want to let you flex your muscles just a little bit. Let's talk now a little bit more about policy. That'd be statute, rules of districts, and give some perspective on, what you'd like to see or where we have tension right now from a policy perspective, from statewide planning to districts that sit on a county line.
Well, as I stated, I've got board members all across the state. The primary production area of irrigation is on the high plains, where we have 3 groundwater districts that primarily, where that is, North Plains, High Plains, and Panhandle. But I've got board members that are scattered around the state that are on single district boards. And one in particular is close to a large city, has had the city come in and their board doesn't, I don't understand exactly how they're set up, but they don't have, when the city's challenged them, they haven't had the funds to come back, or a big industry challenges them. So sometimes that seems to be a problem. I'll probably step on a toe when I say the next one. We've had one of our groups in the area had a water district that was an appointed board rather than an elected board, and it had one farmer vote versus all the rest of the other members. And that seemed to really lead a problem in that district between agriculture and the future, because they said the agriculture was not going to grow, and they set the use for the urban at a 5-year, 10-year out use. That brought a lot of heartburn to some of our members. So some of the rules, some of the things like that, and then, you know, Texas is big, and our concern is always we don't want one to have this deal fixed where one size has to fit all, because every area is different, every aquifer's got some different traits, and that's one of the things that my group, my farmers always say, don't let them make a rule that makes it where everything's got to be the same, because in that we lose. And it's not because people don't care, but it's because we don't have the votes.
Go ahead.
Some of our members have experienced conflict when they're in 2 different water districts and there's different applications of rules over the same aquifer. We have some members that are not in a water district that have been subject to repeated water grabs by municipality that we have to fight every session. And so it's just, I think for a lot of our members, although supportive of all the groundwater districts they're in, it's just the rules are different across the fence line. And it makes it hard for them to understand. You spend more time dealing with regulatory issues at a local level than you do actually producing livestock.
Andrew, any thoughts on that?
You know, the one, when it comes to getting dollars to ground, and it was mentioned all the IRA funds that have come available, you know, the one point that really it kind of remains a choke point is still match requirements in rural communities and for landowners. And we talk about how these open spaces are infrastructure, aquifers are infrastructure. We've become so conditioned in the conservation world as we write these programs to include a match requirement, and now we're often in a place that we can't utilize federal dollars because there's just not the match in place. So increasingly a need to waive those, to amend these programs to lower match requirements at a local level, so that there's better access at both the state and federal level.
Yeah, all 3 of you knew, and in my introductory comments made mention that the legislature last session picked up the right to farm statute and substantially enhanced that. And in doing that, you know, I think the body became very aware of the role that we all play and how important that is. But the one breathtaking part of that is, you know, the voters of Texas approved a constitutional amendment for the right to farm, and overwhelmingly. And I guess my last question to you, and you can be a benevolent dictator or not if you want, but I mean, what do we need to be doing as agriculture to make sure that the voters' desires are met in terms of production?
That's a great question.
Okay, well, you can answer that next time, but no. What are your thoughts?
You know, it's really, I think the rubber meets the road, really. I mean, at the local level, there was a legislative hearing a week or 2 weeks ago about the implementation of right to farm, and I know there are still a handful of ordinances that are in rapidly growing communities in the state, in Frisco and Plano and kind of around the metroplex, where farmers are still kind of butting up against municipalities and a lot of the smaller ordinances that are being developed. I wasn't at the hearing, but you might have more specifics.
No, I wasn't at the hearing,
Okay.
but I think it goes back to education. The rural population couldn't carry that. That came from an urban population. So they support the idea of maintaining the right to farm, to include farming, ranching, wildlife management, overwhelmingly. And I think it's incumbent upon us, through our associations, through all the things we do in the halls of Austin, in the Capitol, that we continue that education process and that it be open and it be transparent. And I think that tells us as producers that they want to know more. They support us. It's part of the Texas identity, and we need to do more in that respect.
Good. Adam, I mean, do we have time for questions? Are we ready to wrap it up?
We have one question that came in.
One question that came in. Mm-hmm. That sounds interesting.
I'm going to ask this to Andrew. How can Texas develop market solutions like groundwater easements or payments to landowners to retire groundwater rights without management guardrails like caps that protect groundwater in place?
Could you repeat the second half of that? I'm sorry.
To landowners to retire groundwater rights without management guardrails like caps that protect groundwater in place.
I know there are. There's been the Texas Water Trust has for some time worked to do that with surface water rights. I'm not entirely sure with groundwater. Maybe someone else up here might be able to.
There was a pilot program around Clovis, New Mexico, and that's where their base is. They were on part of the Ogallala. They, through conservation easements, have changed a lot of the farm ground to grasslands, and they still have some pumping rights, but it's been dramatically reduced. They did that in order to keep that base there at Clovis. It's a very specific program, but I think it's a wonderful example of doing that.
Okay.
Oh, we have one more question, sorry.
Yeah, do you have time? So it's been brought up multiple times about possible compensation for conserving groundwater in place or not producing. I don't disagree with that. I understand that's a private property right issue, but that does little to foster the ag industry, innovation, food security, national security. Has there been any discussion about setting aside a certain volume of water for ag, food and fiber production that is untouchable, instead of just continually saying municipal demand is going to increase, ag by default is going to decrease? There's got to be a breaking point, right? Is that possible? Has it already been discussed, setting aside an untouchable volume in Texas?
I think what would make that tough is just the unpredictable nature of the weather we have to operate and how it impacts, whether it's food and fiber, beef, wildlife management. It's just so hard to make an accurate projection of that.
I'll jump in. I'm supposed to be a moderator and not have opinions, but I do. I think it's an excellent point, which, talking with ag groups, going back to my analogy of the desired future condition, we do talk a lot about food security, and people particularly during COVID, became very aware of that. And unless we want to preserve that, if we have, as agriculture, to provide that food security, you have to work backwards and determine what you need now. And so I think you're right. I think we really do somebody has to do the math on that to say, in order to achieve that level of food production and support rural communities, how much groundwater do you need in order to do that? I think your point is excellent. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you, guys.